I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap.
All right, good afternoon. Ed Sterling here for a second railroad-based presentation to our friends here in Berlin. This is a little quirky lecture. We're going up to Bolton today, for the most part, from Hudson through Bolton and into Lancaster. A couple interesting stories as part of that. Otherwise, you would think this would seem to be very boring, trying to trace some old railroad that's 150 years old. I find it curious, and there's a gentleman named Michael Volk who, he's as crazy as I am. He's worse, okay? He goes traipsing around in the mud, trying to find old tracks and things like that. So I want to give him credit, because a lot of photographs that he's offered us today are his credit here. This is a little bit of the route, if you will. It's a map that Michael made. We're down in Hudson on the lower corner, and we're going up Route 85 there in kind of blue and green, crossing the interstate. We go through Bolton, a little bit of a red stretch there in the middle, and we get down to about the Neshoba High School, and when we kind of turn a hard left, and we go down toward the International Golf Course at that point, crossing over the international property and going off into Lancaster to what's called the South Lancaster Station, which is long gone. There's an old freight building there. From terms of a landmark, there's kind of a nice little restaurant called Sandy's. And so the train would have stopped right around the Sandy's restaurant that you see on Route 70 on Lancaster Main Street. Just gives you an idea of what the length of the railroad was. So it started at the old train station in Hudson. Now, we talked about that last week. That's long gone. And today there's a Shell station and a Subway sandwich, and I think an insurance company. The very next place beyond that is Hudson Appliance, which most of us know. And we talked about the old bar lunch restaurant that was popular in those days, which is gone now, and Hudson Appliance took that over. So this Lancaster Railroad would have started here at the old station. So the old station would have been right around in here. And then, interestingly, the track of this Lancaster Railroad would have crossed Hudson's Main Street and gone up right through a pond going toward Bolton. Right? So you wonder, was there nothing there? Were there homes that had to be taken away to get these tracks through it? It's kind of puzzling. There's some very, very faint remnants even today of where that railroad went in downtown Hudson. But it becomes much clearer as you go up Route 85, and in the woods, you see a very distinct railroad track bed raised way up in the woods, and that goes quite far up Route 85 in Bolton. So again, here's the old station, and where the house is in back, the tracks would have curved and start to go up Route 85. And this is just kind of a color representation. The railroad we talked about last week would be the green stretch. And that's the tracks that are still there today that might become another rail trail. It's kind of hard to say. The yellowish stretch is the rail trail that they built a number of years ago that's very popular now with all the bicyclists. All right? And you can see it curving down as it goes to Marlboro, up the hill. The blue stretch would have been the old Lancaster Railroad going right across the pond and up Route 85. This is the only known photograph of the Lancaster Railroad. It's this bridge that they built right across the mill pond, somewhat near where the lumber company is. I think it's Larkin Lumber today, if I'm not mistaken. Lamson Lumber? Okay. So it went across the pond, and that apparently would be Manning Street, according to what I've read, all right? Which is the fairly popular street that gets you down to Broad Street and the old factory that's still there. Right? It eventually made its way through Bolton into Lancaster, And so the red stretch is where it would have come down over the river and into the existing track system that went north on what they called the Worcester and Nashua Railroad. Actually went all the way up to Portland, Maine. So it just gives you a sense of where it is. Again, South Lancaster was sometimes known as Thayer. The very wealthy Thayer family would have used that almost as their personal station, according to what I've seen. So I have this is just some text we'll kind of rush through. It comes from a book that was published by the Boston and Maine Historical Society. You can see it says it was chartered in 1870 during what they called this railroad fever period. And we talked a little bit about that last week. Even the railroad that ran through Berlin was part of this railroad fever, that after the Civil War, technology had increased substantially. You still had nothing but your horse and buggy, and so for farmers to move, loads of apples and dairy and so on, all you had was a horse and wagon. And so now everyone was clamoring for a train because it would substantially increase commerce in your town or your village. And so the craziest ideas came up as to put in railroads in places where they really didn't deserve to be. So this was a railroad of what you call nowhere to nowhere. All right? And as it mentions, it says it was undercapitalized. That was true of many railroads. They started off with a big promise and a dream, and the money just never materialized. And so they would have these poor men working, and they hardly got paid half the time, and there were strikes and fights. The board of directors fought with each other. There's reports of black eyes coming out of board of director meetings because they couldn't decide on anything properly. They had these big plans of stopping in Bolton and having three different little stations up in Bolton. They talked about, in some cases, respectable newspapers only could be sold at the stations, and something like no popcorn and prizes, and the Sunday Herald was allowed. Okay, apparently those were of suspicious nature. What's interesting is that no sooner had they created most of the line than they had a lawsuit against some man who claimed that they had ruined his dam, and so with his mill it wasn't working properly, and so this lawsuit essentially bankrupted them almost immediately. So it went into bankruptcy, and they never came out of it. They tried, they never got enough money, and a gentleman named Codman came along and bought the railroad for a dime on the dollar. And lo and behold, it turns out he was part of the Fitchburg Railroad, quite a large enterprise in those days. And the Fitchburg Railroad would eventually be taken over by the Boston and Maine. So really it was kind of a secret deal to get their hands on this railroad and block out the competition if it ever amounted to anything. So they tried to have a little timetable here. It said 1876. Everything I've seen said whatever happened at that railroad happened well before that. So these seem to be kind of pipe dreams that anybody would think that the train was going to run. And there at the bottom it says, the sale of peanuts, popcorn, and prize packages in the Sunday Herald was prohibited. This house on the hill was recently renovated up on Route 85. It was kind of an old farmhouse, and it was all spruced up in a recent development. And the asphalt we see down below, there's a big development that got built up behind the house. So this was the home of a farmer named Nahum Stratton. And Nahum apparently was out doing his haying in the field off Route 85, and he heard this train chugging along, and it turned out to be the one and only train that ever ran. And so apparently his little granddaughter was with him out in the field, and they ran over to the tracks and waved, and the engineer stopped, and he said, could I get a ride with my little granddaughter? And they said, okay, go ahead and get on the car. So apparently it was the board of directors in their passenger car doing an inspection of the line that they had built. But it was the one and only run. And so it turned out that the little girl, who would later become Mrs. Arla Minor, was really the only passenger, aside from her grandfather, to ever really get a ride on the railroad, aside from the board of directors. And apparently this was quite a vivid memory of hers throughout her life, that she had the only train ride. And that's the house that Nahum Stratton lived in. Okay. The Bolton geranium. That little girl grew up to marry an Arthur Minor, who apparently worked for that wealthy Thayer family over in Lancaster. And he worked in the greenhouses there. And one day, apparently, he encountered this unusual flower in the geraniums that had a pink and pink and white flower, and he separated it and took it home to Orla, and she began to propagate this, and this is known today as the Bolton geranium. And apparently they were very popular in the area during the 1900s, but unfortunately they were down to one plant by 1970. I guess there just weren't enough people interested in it, and so the famous Mrs. Sawyer of Bolton history fame apparently rescued the plant, and from there they've propagated them, and now every year there's a Bolton geranium sale at the Bolton Historical Society, all coming from that one unusual plant that Orla Miner's husband found in the greenhouse so many years ago. It's pretty remarkable. So this is another kind of curiosity. I'm kind of going through some curious things here that I would hope you'd find interesting. I call it Deeds Live Forever. You may remember a Crystal Springs campground on Route 117 in the middle of Bolton. I think it started in the 1950s, and there was a little pond, I think, along the... So a family called Doucette, I believe, were the last owners of it, and they went to sell it, I think, around I'm not sure if I have the date, but 1999. I was selectman at the time, as I recall, and there was some possible interest by the town of seeing if the land was of any value. It was decided not, okay? And so the Toll brothers, a famous builder, nationwide builder, came in and made them an offer, and they sold the property. Well, what's curious is that apparently as they went through the legal deeds and so on, they realized that the old Lancaster Railroad had run right through the middle of the campground, 100 years ago. And so I guess their attorney said, I know that the railroad hasn't run in 100 years, but normally when you have an easement like that to operate a railroad, you want to get rid of it. And so curiously, I think it was a little bit of a steal, frankly, by the railroad. They had to pay $4,000 to this bankrupt railroad, and I don't know who would have accepted the check, quite honestly, because the railroad was long bankrupt. But out of the woodwork came someone saying, I'm part of the Boston and Maine railroad system, and I'll take that $4,000, thank you, and we'll discharge the easement. So here was one of the last things I've ever seen legally where the railroad interfered, in a sense, with somebody's property, not having run since something like 1875. It's like I say, it's kind of curious that sometimes these easements live on forever and ever. And there's the deed. They did put up a nice little plaque when the Toll brothers built the condo project in there with evidence of the railroad. So it says 1872, Lancaster Railroad was here and was abandoned in 1875. The dates are roughly correct. Okay, that's the only real monument that I'm aware of to the railroad itself. This gentleman named Michael Volk, who is interested in the subject as much as I am, he believes that this is the only evidence of the railroad that anyone has ever found. It's a railroad tie, and apparently it's in the woods by the Boy Scout camp. So he's trying to extract it to see if he can take it to the Bolton Historical Society. Good luck, I think it weighs a couple 100 pounds. And it's frozen right now, of course. So he's hoping to rescue that. Napoleon Bonaparte. Why would I put a picture of Napoleon Bonaparte in the middle of a presentation of the Lancaster Railroad? Seems insane, doesn't it? Well, there is a story. A prosperous gentleman in Bolton named Samuel S.V. Wilder, whose house is still there on Wilder Road, which is the road that goes to the International Golf Course in Bolton off of Route 117. He was quite a merchant over in France, very, very prosperous merchant, and learned French and came to the attention of Napoleon in those days, and apparently even stood in for the American ambassador, who was ill at the time at Napoleon's wedding. So he was pretty well connected to reach that level of French society. That's the portrait from the Worcester Art Museum, Samuel Wilder. So being a good friend of Napoleon, and Napoleon being in big trouble in 1815 and facing exile, Wilder tried to convince Napoleon to come to Bolton. And he built a cottage in the woods for him. And they called it Tadmor. And the cottage foundation is still there. And it's hard to believe that it still would be there. And it seems to be a pretty quiet story. It's hard to find a lot of information about the details. But the claim is that Wilder said to Napoleon, look, you know, you're a wanted man. We'll disguise you as some kind of a valet of mine. And once we get on the ship, I'm going to get you into a giant barrel. And we're going to build a barrel with a hidden compartment for you. And we're going to put like some kind of rum or something or water on top. And so if somebody looks in the barrel, they'll see the water and they'll close it back up. But Napoleon would be inside just to get out of the port to take the voyage over to America. And then he could come and live in this cabin for a while things cooled down, and maybe he could get his army going again. Well, Napoleon, I guess, said, that's quite an insult from where my position is in France to end up in a barrel on a ship. Okay, thanks for the offer, but I'll take my chances. And of course, Napoleon ended up, I think, in St. Helena, where he died. So the curiosity is that the Lancaster Railroad ran right on top of Napoleon's wine cellar. So this is the foundation that's still there. There's a pretty good picture of it. A whole bunch of pine trees have grown up inside. And again, more corners of this foundation of this cottage. And there's the wine cellar. And it's still there in the hillside, and the railroad is right on top. It's that, I mean, you take my word for it, there's a flat railroad right away. But the wine cellar ended up, if you will, at the bottom of the railroad embankment. So there's a time issue here. This is 1815, all right, and the railroad came in 1870. So clearly, it just happened to be that the railroad came right beside this little cottage that was abandoned, you know, many years before. But kind of looks like a wine cellar to me. So this is what you see today all around Bolton, east side, west side. Unusual kind of roads, trails in the woods, all raised up where the tracks used to be. And there, as I say, as far as we know, there just are no tracks left. This is pretty on Century Mill Road off of 85. And again, the railroad paralleled Route 85 on the left side, the west side, substantially. Somebody has quite a nice trail, if you will, where the railroad ran. And this was the bridge, obviously not that bridge, but the stonework was all put in. So the stonework still survives to this day, all over town. These tended to be what they call a cattle underpass. So that existed all along the railroad right up here, the Central Mass on Highland Street, all through Waltham and Wayland, wherever there were cattle in those days. They needed a pass for the animals to go and not walk on the track. Most cattle won't want to do that, so you need to build something to get them from one side of the track to the other. This is at the Boy Scout camp, Camp Resolute. And the pathway is as clear as can be up there. Obviously, it's kind of a maintained trail for the scouts to go from one of their campsites up to the main building. And you finally get to 495, and there we are looking at 495, having walked through the woods. So on a good clear day, and this is about the time to do it, so don't get hurt, and slow down and be careful, but you can see the trough of the tracks in the woods, now that the leaves are still off the trees, coming from the Boy Scout camp right up to 495. And you kind of wonder, like, what is that? It's bizarre. Like, what is that trough? That was where the railroad was. So the interstate people, they put in fences, you know, all along the route. And so that's blocked off at that point. Right in the middle, the median on 495, it certainly looks to me like the pathway is still there. There were, again, you know, little granite pipes and tunnels for streams and so on. So certainly something was flowing in those days. And then on the side, on the west side, again, be careful doing it, but as you come out of Bolton and you start southbound down to Berlin, be careful, there's a big cell tower, and then you see in the rocks a V cut, and they had to hand dig that out of the rock for the pathway of the railroad. And of course, this is all before the interstate. So that was there even before the interstate, that cut like a V. And there's a runner's trail that goes down through the woods on the old railroad track. And there it continues. It goes all the way out to the International Golf Course, and then the road that comes down from the driving range of Twin Springs, the railroad cuts across there. And you can see the golf course is running on top of where the railroad was. So it would have ended up in South Lancaster. One of the curiosities is, how did they get across the Nashua River? So a couple that lives on Mill Street, that's that nice little bridge if you're going over to Shaw's, let's say, from Bolton Orchards, and you want to get to Shaw's, you kind of make a little bit of a curve. It's called Mill Street, and it goes eventually down to the Sterling Road, which goes out to the Rhoda Ice Cream and beyond to Route 62. Okay, they have in their backyard this highest embankment that was one of the last stretches of the railroad, and there was something built on top of it, and they called me one day and they thought maybe it was like a little train station. It wasn't. Somebody had built, I don't know, maybe a garden shed years and years ago, but there's something of a foundation. And so we checked it out, and it turned out to not really be anything that was part of the railroad equipment. It was just on the track bed. And as we stood at the top of the embankment, way, way down below is the Nashua River. And I thought, there would have been a tremendous bridge required to get that train across the gulf of that riverbank. And I've never been able to find any evidence of that. And I can't imagine how this bankrupt railroad would have started down in Hudson and sweated all the way up through Bolton and eventually gotten to the river and gone, oh my God, how are we going to build a bridge? So I'm still working, hoping that there's some evidence, but I have a feeling they ran out of money at that point. And they talked about that one train ride, and I wonder if that one train ride ended at that high embankment with everybody wondering how are we going to get across the river at this point. So it's a curiosity. This is the old South Lancaster station way back in the day, and that's what they would have connected to. And sometimes it was called Thayer. Again, that was the power of the Thayer family in those days, and still pretty substantial in Lancaster history. So again, this just gives you a sense of what the railroad trace is going up through Route 85. You see all these remnants still in the woods. That's a good time of year for it because the leaves aren't there. The minute the leaves come in, all this disappears and there's nothing left. So that's all I really have. Again, it's kind of a novel curiosity of a little railroad that never should have been built. It never made any money. It never would have made any money because there's no industry in Bolton at all, except a few apple farmers here and there. They claim there was, I think, a shoe factory somewhere along the line, but it's unclear that they would have ever had enough business to justify the whole cost of a railroad like that. And so again, it's a monument to this railroad fever that occurred when everybody thought, you know, we need a railroad everywhere. And finally, in the end, the Depression really killed all these little branch lines all over America. The Depression really was the death knell of that, and ended a lot of passenger service on the railroads as well, really pretty much for a long time to come. A little bit of revival during World War II, but again, that really beat the equipment, and it was quite expensive to rebuild after the war, and that's why most of the national rail system tended to fail during the 1950s. And eventually we ended up with Amtrak and Conrail. But today it's funny, the freight business is very strong. And locally we have CSX over here on the west side of Berlin going up north and south. And you have Norfolk and Western out in the west part of the country and the Burlington Northern. So out there, the freight traffic is substantial and very important. But the passenger service is still kind of a novelty to ride on Amtrak. But still, I'm sure it will be fun.